Welcome to the Maintainable Software Podcast, where we explore the art of improving existing software with seasoned practitioners who have helped organizations overcome the problems often associated with technical debt and legacy code. I'm your host, Robby Russell. On this episode, Adriana Villela is a speaker, blogger, host of the podcast On Call Me Maybe, and is currently a senior developer advocate at Lightstep. Adriana joins us from Toronto, Canada. Adriana Villela, welcome to Maintainable.
Thanks for having me on.
So as you reflect on your experience in our industry, what do you believe are a few common characteristics of, dare I say, well-maintained software?
Well, for me, well-maintained software is software that you can actually understand when you go into the code, even if you're not super familiar with it. The worst thing in the world is going to someone else's code and it's like pile of spaghetti where, everything's tightly coupled. You have no idea what's going on. There's like no comments or the comments are like super cryptic, weird naming conventions for variables, methods, whatever. And for me, I'm a serial refactorer. So if I see an opportunity to make my software more beautiful, I will do that because otherwise it stays in my brain and it won't let go of me until I fix it.
Did you go to school to become a serial refactorer?
No. So I studied industrial engineering at the University of Toronto. And so traditionally, industrial engineering doesn't really have anything to do with computers, but my program actually had an information engineering component to it, option, if you will. So I did take a bunch of comp sci type courses, including data structures and algorithms, computer networking, and even microprocessors. But I wouldn't say that was necessarily the core of my program. So the serial refactor, I think, is just me being obsessed with always writing beautiful code and has probably gotten worse over the years as I found better ways of doing things.
It's interesting in your background in industrial engineering, right?
Yeah.
You think about working on beautiful code. How would you describe what beautiful code is? Because I think that to me feels like a subjective thing because what is beauty in the eyes of the...
True. I guess it would be subjective, but I think there are a few things that are common to beautiful code, which is it's so simple and elegant that you're like, oh my God, why didn't I think of that? And I think when you achieve that with your code, even though it was it took a while to get to that point, but if you achieve that with your code, I think that makes it beautiful. Something where it's not verbose, but there's verbose code where it's so non-verbose that it's trying to figure out what the hell is happening in a regular expression. Sure, it's compact, but what the hell's going on? So you kind of strike that balance between code that's not overly verbose, but still easy to understand. And I think code that's not tightly coupled so that, I love me some modular code. If there's something where I'm like, oh my God, I can reuse this somewhere else. Giddy up, I'm excited to reuse that piece.
Where do you find that balance between you're working on improving the code base, making it beautiful, breaking things down in different, making it more modular, and you were bringing up reuse. How do you balance when it pre-optimizing or putting too much time into that, thinking that, do you feel like there's a good distinction of when you will make something that could be reusable versus when it is reusable? Because sometimes we might work on things and you can keep polishing something thinking one day this could be amazing to do all these other things, but how do you balance those that line there?
Yeah, I do think there have been points where I've definitely over-engineered things to the point where, you try to make something so reusable that you make it so generic that you're almost starting to account for every single possibility. And I think when you get to that point, you got to kind of start taking a step back and think, okay, this is overkill. And either it's overuse of reflection, I have a Java background and I loved using reflection, but I know that reflection bit me in the ass a couple of times. Or where you're finding yourself all of a sudden putting a bunch of if statements in your code, which red flag, right?
But isn't that how they teach us to understand the order of how things can operate and stuff like that? Where do you when you get to that point, when you show up to an existing application code base, I'm not trying to pick on the if statement thing there, but I think in terms of like when you're someone joining a project and things are well organized, like you mentioned, like comments can be good things to help, and like it's verbose but not maybe overly verbose. When you're trying to piece together something that's been abstracted in a lot of different ways, that you're kind of like, well, how do I get a sense of the whole picture when you're kind of like you weren't there to design it. So like what sort of things or artifacts you find to be useful as an engineer coming into a project and or creating for the unknown future engineers that are going to join that project?
Well, a few things. So the comments definitely help. I guess there's a fine line with the comments as well. I think at the very least, you gotta at least, if you're working with like an in-house framework or whatever, or a set of libraries, like document your public methods, so you know what the hell is going on, right? So like your inputs, outputs. What's this thing doing? Bare minimum. Even if you don't comment stuff inside the method, let's give us an idea of what's going on. If you can, depending on what you've got, like if you have some sort of like general documentation of uses of, your frameworks, libraries, etc., I think that's super helpful. That's a little bit trickier, unless you have something like kind of like with Java docs where, you're documenting your methods already, so you can auto generate some documentation around that. That's useful. But I do find maintaining documentation very difficult. That's where then a debugger comes in very handy, so that you can step through the code to figure out what the heck is going on. I think the debugger is your best friend at that point.
No, I agreed there. When it comes to things like importance of documentation and commenting code, do you when do you typically work on that? Is it when you're working on some new functionality or refactoring? Do you tend to do a lot of documentation then, or is it something you always kind of put on I need to come back and do this later when there's more, I'm air quoting, more time available? Do you have like a strategy that you've seen work well for you and for your team on keeping not only documentation, adding to it as you're working on new things, but also maintaining things that have been around for a while?
I think definitely as you're refactoring and trying to understand the code, especially if it's code that you haven't touched before, it's really important to document as you go. And by document as you go, I'm not saying like, oh, I figured out what this thing does, let's like write about it right away. But at least like once you've gotten things, because like as you're going through someone else's code, like it's an archaeological dig of sorts, right? So you might like take little notes in a notebook or whatever on the side to just figure out what the heck this thing is doing. And then once you've like reached this point where you're like, okay, this looks like it's sufficiently refactored for now, I think that's a good opportunity to sit down and document what the thing does.
I think that's helpful to think through. And I mean, it seems obvious, but I know that I've worked on so many different like projects that it was always like, well, if I had more time, I would write more documentation and I'll come back to this. And then like, well, I need to work on some documentation at some point. And then sometimes that day never comes. So I think it's interesting to think about how you're doing that within the steps that when you're doing the work or working on refactoring. Is it a safe assumption that you find yourself more often on team refactor than say team rewrite?
I think it's like maybe 50-50. Like sometimes I've definitely been in situations where I'm like, this thing just feels like I'm, when you're refactoring, sometimes it can feel like it's duct tape and Band-Aids on your code that you're putting. And I think when you get to the point where you're like, this, the best thing to do is a rewrite, I think the rewrite ends up winning. So it really depends on the situation.
What sort of conditions do you think it's appropriate to advocate for a rewrite within your team or an organization?
I think when you've gotten to the point where, how do you describe it? It's almost like a feeling, like you're working through the code and you're like, this thing just looks like, we're giving it life support. It's like spaghetti and it doesn't seem to make sense. Like when you're working on the refactor and it doesn't make sense in your mind anymore, and you're losing track of what it is that you're supposed to be doing, I think it's time for a rewrite. And it doesn't mean that like the whole damn thing gets a rewrite. It could be like module gets a rewrite. Sometimes it's kind of like writing, like writing a paper, writing a blog post or whatever, I find myself, like, I blog a lot. I find myself sometimes I'm writing a blog post and I'm going down this train of thought, and I write out this whole paragraph and I'm like, I hate it. And, sometimes I'll like try to rewrite the paragraph and it's like, it's not sounding great. So what I'll do is I'll actually like push it way down to the bottom of the page. It exists, but like now it's not at the top of my mind. And then, so I've got like this clean slate for rewriting, and my mind is fresher because it takes away the biases. I think that's the problem sometimes when you're refactoring code, is that you're biased by the previous author. And it can be, the previous author could be you or it could be somebody else. So sometimes it's important to take that bias out and just understand, okay, what is this thing supposed to do? Is it doing the thing it's supposed to be doing? Can I do it in a different way, in a way that's different than the way it's presented right now?
It's an interesting idea about thinking about like how you could do that with code, or even like if you're just to restructure something. But I like that idea, thinking around how you're thinking about blog posts too. And there's definitely like a lot of unfinished blog posts, or not so much that were unfinished. It's just, I decided like, I don't know where I'm going with this right now. And I think I need to come back and like revisit and be a little bit more concise with what I'm trying to convey here.
Yeah, exactly.
Could you tell us a little bit more about your experiences, or do you have a story that you recall where you came into a project and you quickly, or maybe over a period of time, realized that this was some really poorly structured code?
Yeah. So I think like one of my, God, this was like almost 20 years ago. So I was working on this team where this guy had worked on some code and he left the team. And they brought me in to like finish what he had started. And I go and look at his code. And this guy should never have been allowed to touch a computer ever for writing code, because like he did not fundamentally understand.
Wait. Did you, what was the name of this company? Was that might have been me. That might have been my code.
Yeah, it was pretty terrifying. I was like, oh my God, this guy never went to school for coding. They must have been just like throwing him onto this thing because like he just did not understand what a loop was. He took the same piece of code and repeated it like 5 times or whatever. And I'm like, are you kidding me? So I had to go and take his repeated code and turn it into loops. And of course it was like one big block of code, so I had to modularize it as best as I could. It was hairy. It was very hairy. I was very angry having to refactor his code because I'm like, oh my God, how can anybody be so like clueless as to how to code? But then, when it was finished, I'm like, it's beautiful.
When you're kind of thinking, do you often use the metaphor technical debt in the type of work that you're currently doing today?
Not for my current work, but definitely technical debt has come up in many, many conversations over the years as I've touched many a different code base. Yeah, something that's definitely top of mind. I wrote a blog post on technical debt, I think a couple of years ago too, because I, having a discussion with my boss at the time of like, when is it acceptable to have technical debt? Because code's never going to be perfect when it goes into production. Like that's, the old saying, perfect is the enemy of good. And we do have to like sometimes take a step back and make some decisions and make some assumptions and just go to production with certain things that are not quite perfect. But I think the problem becomes when you don't pay down the technical debt, or you take too long to pay down the technical debt, and all of a sudden this thing turns into a big code bomb just waiting to explode when the wrong person touches it, or like even a well-meaning developer who's like not sure exactly what this thing was doing.
Do you feel like your definition, how you would talk about what technical debt is different now than it was, or say 20 years ago earlier in your career, if you might have used it back then?
Probably, because I think 20 years ago when I started out, I think like I was definitely, I'm still an idealist, but I was definitely a lot more of an idealist. And my thought was like, all technical debt should be paid down all the time. And I don't think that's realistic, but I think that we can definitely do things in, our day-to-day to reduce the technical debt so that we don't, introduce technical debt into a new project. And for example, like, how many times have we been asked to POC things? POC goes great, and they're like, great, build it off the POC. Guess what? You're introducing technical debt right there. But then there's, the times, more mature me is like, yeah, sometimes you got to just let certain things go, but make the plans to pay down the technical debt. That's where you tend to get in trouble.
It's true. Do you find that there's been some good strategies for the teams you've been a part of do you keep a running list of those things? Do you earmark a percentage of your time to work on those things? Is there like, what sort of workflow has actually worked so that as an engineer, you feel like there's a reliable time and place for when we will actually address these things versus hoping that there's going to be some day when there's not enough other things to focus on? I guess we can do that today.
Yeah. So, well, I guess there's two schools of thought. So when I was, the engineer writing the code, there'd be times where I'd be like, I don't care. It's going to take me extra time. I'm just going to fix this thing because I'm tired. I'm tired of this thing. And it was like, surprise, manager, look what I did. Yeah. Did the little sneaky, ask for forgiveness rather than permission. Sometimes I think we got to do that because sometimes our managers are too far deep in other things to recognize the importance of doing that. Then there's, the other side where I've been the manager and, having to put aside the time, like, okay, guys, this thing is breaking all the time. This is bad. We gotta put aside some time to pay down the technical debt, whether it's through a refactor or rewrite. That depends on what time we have left, but you got to sometimes like pull the cord and say, woo. It's kind of like even in the world of SRE, like one of the principles that I believe in for site reliability engineering is like part of the time for an SRE should be spent on ensuring the system reliability. So if things are like totally breaking, like, part of it is like, yeah, keep the lights on, automate things that you can automate, but also like if you're noticing that there are things that aren't working as well as they ought to, one of the things that I've always liked about SRE is like whenever there's an on-call, whenever an SRE is on call, they don't focus on doing any project work. They instead focus on improving the reliability of that system when they're hopefully not fighting a fire, which I always thought was a really good principle. And I think that's something we should borrow from SRE more often, to be honest.
We'll be back with our interview with Adriana in just a moment. Hi, it's me, Robby. I just wanted to take a quick moment to say thank you for listening to the Maintainable Software Podcast. If you're enjoying these conversations, please consider sharing a link amongst your peers and or writing a review on Apple Podcasts to help spread the word. Seriously, go over to Apple Podcast and find Maintainable. There's a link in the show notes and go rate 3, 2, 4, 5 stars. And if you're not sure what you can write in the, in the little description with what your review could be, to say, I really like the episode with Adriana Villela. That's something you could do. You can be like, Robby has a weird voice. Robby does awkward, middle of the interview callouts like this, and it's weird. And maybe if I write a review, he'll stop asking me to write a review. Unfortunately, I will probably keep asking you to do it. But anyways, is there someone that you think I should be speaking with on Maintainable? Why don't you shoot me an email to robby@maintainable.fm and state your case. And now, let's get back to our interview with Adriana Villela. What is Lightstep? Could you give us a quick little introduction to the organization you work with?
Yeah, so Lightstep is an observability company. They were acquired by ServiceNow a couple of years ago. I think officially now we are ServiceNow Cloud Observability. I believe that's our official name. But basically we have a product for observability. So observability is basically the ability for someone to be able to understand what is going on in the system. Like the system is emitting enough information to us so that even if we don't know exactly what the nitty-gritty is behind the scenes, it's emitting enough information so that we can follow the breadcrumbs to answer that age-old question, why is this happening?
What's the day-to-day life look like for a senior developer advocate for those that might not be familiar with that role?
Oh yeah, so my role is interesting. I'm 1 year into developer advocacy type of role. I focus mostly on the open source side of things, so I work a lot on OpenTelemetry and OpenTelemetry. So my definition of observability, where the system is emitting that information, well, OpenTelemetry is the way to emit that information. So it's a vendor neutral way for emitting signals for your application or your systems to emit signals, so that you can determine what is going on. So OpenTelemetry is a vendor neutral framework for emitting, traces, metrics, logs. And the nice thing is, like, all the observability vendors are like fully in on it. So everybody is standardizing on it. So as part of my day-to-day, I actually work with folks from competing vendors to try to continue to make OpenTelemetry awesome.
That's awesome. So is that like OpenTelemetry something that is that like a separate service you're running in parallel, and then you would integrate with another third party, or is it more of like a standardized middle layer API type thing that you would feed, like say if you have a Java app or a Ruby app or what have you, and you would like use some sort of library that knows how to interact with you can kind of inject code specifically that will send signals to whatever vendor that you're wanting to work with, but with a consistent localized API, I suppose, that you're interacting with?
Yeah, it's kind of that idea. So it's basically a framework for instrumenting your code. It can also be used for like it can also be used to collect instrumentation data from your infrastructure. But basically, there's an API and SDK for OpenTelemetry, and they've got language specific SDKs. So I think pretty much every language, I don't want to say every language out there, but it covers a breadth of languages, including like Erlang and Rust. Rust is popular these days. So but the popular ones that we know of, that we hear about all the time, like Java, Python, .NET, Node.js. Sure, I'm missing. Oh, Go, of course. Ruby. At one point, they're trying to start up a library for Perl, but no luck just yet. But yeah, like the idea is you instrument your code. So, just as you would think of it as like you have like a logging library for Java, well, instead you can use the OpenTelemetry logging. But not just logging, like for observability, like the secret sauce of observability, my take of it anyway, I'm a bit of a purist, is tracing. And so because traces give that end-to-end view, right? They transcend the network boundaries. So now like you can have a Java service interacting with the Go service, and the traces will connect that interaction, right? So how they're working together, and then within the trace you can have like the log messages that specify, hey, what's happening at that point in time. So OpenTelemetry allows us to instrument our code, and then you can send the data through what's called the OpenTelemetry collector, which is basically like a vendor neutral binary that it's a data pipeline, so it ingests the telemetry from different sources, whether it's from your application or your infrastructure. You can do some additional transformation to it if you would like. So if you need to obfuscate your data, for example, especially if you're sending logs across to whatever system, and you don't want your PII data sent over, so you can obfuscate your data, and then you can specify where to send it to. So any basically OpenTelemetry compatible backend. So whether it's something like Lightstep, or I should say ServiceNow Cloud Observability, you've got Datadog, New Relic, Honeycomb, like any of those vendors that I'm sure a lot of folks have heard of, you can send it to those. And the cool thing is you can send it to multiple backends at the same time. So if you're like, hey, I'm between these 2 or 3 vendors, you can send the data to these vendors. And what differentiates the vendors is how they're rendering the data. So because OpenTelemetry and observability are not the same, OpenTelemetry enables observability. So like, great, we're emitting the same data. What are you doing with my data that's going to help me figure out what's going on? That's the differentiating factor.
That's interesting. Yeah, I had not like looked into it that much, but we work on a lot of different projects for different clients, and I work in the consulting world, and so there's tends to be like, oh, you're already using this sort of monitoring tool like New Relic or something, and there's some code in the applications that are already very, very tailored towards interacting with New Relic's API versus like say Sentry or some other platform. And so sometimes we're like, well, there's already a bunch of code here. If we wanted to switch platforms, we got to go replace all the little instrumentation code in the process, and so it sounds like there might be another option out there for us to explore too. Because then we're always like, well, we want to try this other thing out, but like we don't want to take out the one we already have necessarily. But I like that idea of building it to have, like, compare them like in parallel at the same time. That sounds kind of.
Yeah. It's really great. And I did it at my previous job where we were like looking at a bunch of different observability vendors who were sending it to 3 at the same time. I'm like, oh my God, this is so cool.
Hi there. We hope you're enjoying this week's episode of Maintainable. While you've been listening, has anyone crossed your mind who might be looking for help with their Ruby on Rails application? Planet Argon, the producer of Maintainable Podcast, would love to meet them. In fact, we've got a pretty sweet referral bonus program set up. If you send someone our way and they sign up for Planet Argon services, we'll give them a $1,000 discount. And your reward? We'll send you $1,000 just for connecting us to the right person. Sounds like a win-win for everyone. Head on over to planetargon.com/referrals for more info. That's planetargon.com/referrals. All right, let's get back to this week's episode.
I'm curious if you have, when it comes to observability, what are some considerations that developers should make so that code is more, dare I say, observable?
From a developer standpoint, put yourself in as developers, we all have to debug our code, right? So put on your debugging hat and think, if I were to troubleshoot, as I'm troubleshooting my own code, what are the things that are important to me so that I have the information? It's kind of like, like traditionally when you're going about and you're all of a sudden you're testing your code and something breaks and you're like, what the hell is going on? And you realize, oh, I'm missing a log message because I don't have visibility into this. That's basically like you're starting to put observability into your system, right? Because it's like, oh, I don't have sufficient information to debug. I need to add that information. Once you feel like you're at the point where you're like, I have sufficient information to debug, your system is observable. And just making sure from a developer standpoint, and I think this is probably the trickiest part, is to have that trace sort of mindset when you're instrumenting your code, the trace first approach. The log messages are still important, right? Because they give you that additional context of what is happening at that point in time. But the traces will start to paint that picture, right, of what's going on across the board. And I think that's super important. And then the other cool thing about it is there's this whole movement towards trace-based testing, where the idea is, okay, your code is already emitting traces. How about we take these traces and create automated integration tests from these? So now you're putting observability in the hands of the QAs as well. So you can use that as a quality gate at the same time, because it's like, well, hey, developers, have you instrumented your code sufficiently so I can create my integration tests, right? And if the answer is no, then it's not properly instrumented. QAs can't create their integration tests. And the cool thing is there are a couple of tools out there in the market that already do that. One is Trace Test that I've played with a bunch. And then another one that I know of is Helios. They do the same thing, but they take different approaches to it. Trace Test is more declarative, whereas Helios is more imperative. So Helios has, I believe, if I recall, a bunch of libraries for language-specific libraries for writing those integration tests, whereas Trace Test takes more of a YAML approach to writing those integration tests.
That's interesting. Yeah, I've not played with those or heard of those myself yet. So
yeah, they're pretty new in the market. So yeah.
Excellent. I will include links for those in the show notes for everybody. Let's kind of switch gears for a moment. I want to learn a bit more about your podcast, On Call Me Maybe. So can maybe talk a little bit about some of the topics and themes that you tend to focus on that podcast?
Yeah, so our podcast is about DevOps, SRE, observability, reliability, on-call, and anything in between. So we tend to bring on guests who talk about those various topics, but the anything in between also goes. So for example, last season we had somebody who talked about like how to run a successful like agile transformation. We like to keep it like pretty casual and chill. It's just coffee with friends. And nerding out on tech. We also like to raise a lot of like mental health awareness because I think our industry is definitely getting better when it comes to talking about mental health, but it is still stigmatized to a certain extent. So we want to be able to like talk about it openly. And we like to bring in folks from all walks of life, whether it's somebody well known. We had Liz Fong Jones on there for one of our early episodes. We had Nora Jones. We had Adrian Cockcroft to cap off season 2. But we've also had, some quote unquote unknowns who are awesome humans that we know that we want to elevate their voices so that other folks can discover how awesome they are. So yeah, that's basically the gist of the podcast.
That's great. I'm curious, as a fellow podcast host, co-host, how has being a podcast host impacted you? Like, what do you get out of it?
I think I get a lot of like really cool, I get to meet a lot of really cool people. I love being able to share other people's stories. So I think that's been the most fun thing about podcasting. When I started, I was super nervous and I'm like, oh my God, I probably sound super stiff when, in those first few episodes of On Call Me Maybe, because, trying to find my podcasting voice, and Anna, my co-host, and I had just started working together. We joined the DevRel team at Lightstep at the same time. But we jive super well. So that's been really fun, just getting to riff off each other and having fun with our guests. And I think it's helped too because as part of the work that I do with OpenTelemetry, I work as part of I'm one of the co-chairs of the end user working group. And so we run these monthly Q&A sessions, for example, where we talk to some practitioners of OpenTelemetry, where we get to ask them, hey, how's it going in your organization? Like, what are the things that are working well? What are the challenges? And I've gotten to run a couple of those Q&As. And I feel because of the podcasting experience, the Q&As have gone, I'd say, pretty smoothly, because I think to me, it feels like just another podcast episode in some ways.
That's I can relate to that. I've not actually done any interviews or episodes so far I've done about 100, a little over 150 of these now, I think, that I've recorded. And the idea of having multiple guests or like a co-host, I'm like, that feels complicated to me. And so I've been like, so sometimes there's been people that have wanted to like, oh, me and my co-partner, my co-founder would come on together. I'm like, I don't know how to make that work well yet. So if anyone's listening is wondering why it's just a bunch of individual guests, that's why I'm like, how to logistically do that, and how much more complicated does the editing process get, and will I still be able to be a halfway decent interviewer in that capacity? So anyways, maybe I need to just rip the Band-Aid off and give that a go sometime. But
it's not so bad. It's not so bad. I think we had 2 people on at the same time once in season 1. I think the trick is just, making sure you have like the conversation going, that you're not leaving someone out, which I think that's probably the scariest part.
Yeah. I'll reach out and get some advice from you at some point on that.
Yeah, totally.
So kind of circling back over to observability, I've always wondered, you've been around for, in the industry for multiple decades plus, and we have a lot more tooling available, a lot more instrumentation available. Do you feel like it's a lot more complicated for people coming in the industry now to be able to wrap their head around not just the code, but the infrastructure of what it takes to run, a web software application or some sort of application now than it was a couple of decades ago, when we maybe didn't have a lot of access to those tools? I have been around for a long time, and I'm like just wondering, as people coming in, I'm like, this seems like way more complicated in a lot of ways, but we have access to so much more information. But is that easy to wrap your head around? And what's your kind of take on that?
Yeah, that's actually a really interesting question. I think there are 2 ways of looking at it, because so if you look at, definitely things were a lot less complicated 20 years ago. I mean, like, monoliths were king back then, right? And I think back then, like, it was sufficient to have these monitoring systems and these dashboards, and everything was okay, right? It was a lot more predictable. But now, like, in microservice world, as you said, things are a lot more complicated. There's so many more moving parts, and so things are acting in really unpredictable ways. So like observability is the way to help us figure out what the hell is going on in this mess, right? But while things have gotten more complicated, so I think we have two challenges. On the one hand, I think it can be difficult because the folks who are like more old school, who are still like, hey, it worked fine in monitoring world, why won't it work now? Like, I think that is the biggest challenge, right? Because if you grew up in the monitoring world, it's really hard for that paradigm shift. For the folks who are coming in new to it, they're like, yeah, whatever. They're growing up in observability, so it's not as jarring for them. And it's a really good time to get in right now, too, because, you know, OpenTelemetry has matured significantly since I started looking at it a couple of years ago. And because of that standardization, I think it's a lot easier to get started. There's like so many more resources available just so that you can start mucking around with it. And the community's been really good. The challenge is always getting your mind around wanting to do observability, because I think for a lot of folks, observability can be an afterthought in the same way that commenting your code is, right? Because it's like, well, all I need is to make sure that the code is working. Observability be pushed to the side. But if you do that, you're incurring, it's back to that technical debt, right? I think this is one of those instances where like instrumenting as you go along, similar to what's it called? Test-driven development. You've got observability-driven development where you're thinking about making your system observable as you go along. Yeah, it's a little more painful. It's going to be a little more time-consuming, but future you will be a lot happier.
You know, for those listening that might not have a lot of experience, myself included, in interacting with all these observability tools, do you have how does your brain think about being like observability driven, and like if you're building out a new small feature or adding something to existing application? Is it like you're thinking about the type of data things you're going to pass around to, like an exposed things? Like where's that balance between, like, we know there's going to be data getting stored in a database, but what sorts of things about the interaction before you save it to a database might you want to feed it somewhere else? Or is it more, am I not thinking about it the wrong way, and you're actually thinking more about like, it's like being able to trace through like what methods are being called with what parameters, and that?
I guess it's keeping in mind, like, as you're writing your code, like keeping in mind that you'll want to understand the flow of your code. So even like at a very bare minimum, like for example, Java and Python for OpenTelemetry, they have auto instrumentation enabled, where at a bare, which means like it's very low touch. I don't think you even have to like do anything to your code specifically, if I recall correctly. It'll basically auto instrument like your methods, so that it almost puts like a little wrapper around your method saying, okay, there is a trace available for method X and a trace available for method Y, and it'll correlate if those two methods call each other and they're auto instrumented, then it'll do that correlation. So keeping in mind basically just even if you're like manually instrumenting your code, so having to go in and set up the tracing, keeping in mind, hey, at a bare minimum, I probably at least want to create a trace for your methods, and then whether or not you want to add more information to that as you're going along, as you're testing your code, as you're writing your code. Wouldn't it be neat if I added some attributes here to specify like whatever, I'm keeping track of the number of like seconds it took to make this method call or whatever. Or, well, generally that's, I think, automatically done for you. So a better example is I'm keeping track of the number of times this method was called. That's the sort of thing that would be useful.
Do you find that these tools make it also easy to find out what parts of your code are not being called? You know, does it track that sort of things, like this is rarely called, or if there's a method in your application, then you're trying to find some dead code, can it help highlight that? Like, this has never been called like since we've started?
Yeah, I guess because as you're going through and you're like, this thing's never, like, you don't see it in the trace, right? Then it's definitely not being called anywhere, which I think is like really good. And then the other one, like knowing the frequency of a method call is also important, because then I think it can help you also with like just performance tuning. Like, hey, this thing gets called a lot. Maybe we need to like take a second look, especially if like this thing does a lot of database processing.
Just taking a quick time out, and this is Robby, and I just wanted to let you know that we have a new newsletter. If you head over to maintainable.fm and click on newsletter in the top of the navigation, you will be taken to a form where you provide your email address. You understand how this goes. But what you're going to get is an email from me about new episodes with a little bit more backstory about the guests that we're having on, and some links. And then I'll also be shooting over emails every once in a while that will be letting you know, talking about some of the past episodes from the vault, because a lot of these conversations I've intended to be valuable the day of that it's published, but then also years, hopefully decades in the future, because we're talking about things that impact software developers, and we're not talking about what's the latest and greatest new thing. We're talking about just how hard it is to manage software. So again, join the newsletter. What sorts of data metrics do you find to be helpful or valuable to track with the health of your software delivery cycle?
The main ones are like the amount of time that it takes for an operation to complete is super important. Looking at things like CPU usage, memory usage, and you can take those metrics and you can create service level objectives out of them. So it's basically saying like, this is a target that I want to reach. Like, for example, 95% of the time, I don't want my CPU to go above a certain amount, right? So that's an example of a service level objective, or SLO. And if you hit that threshold where you're like breaching the SLO, so it's happening more than 95% of the time, you're like, that is a problem. So you can get it to trigger in a lot of observability systems. You can basically create an SLO, get it to trigger, create an SLO off a metric, get it to trigger an alert. And then you're like, okay, this will, call your on-call team or whoever. This is the starting point for their investigation, right? It's like, there's a thing here that I need to dig into. And then again, it's about following those breadcrumbs triggered through that alert based on a metric.
Right. And so then you're able to go through there and track down like what sorts of things are happening in the system around the, just leading up to that, when it's hitting those spiking, and maybe in that particular example there, I'm often wondering if when teams think about these numbers as they pull up these types of metrics, how they decide what those percentage numbers should be. Like, have you found that you're kind of leaning on a lot of wisdom within the community, or is it kind of like you're picking a number out of the air? Like, how do you decide when it gets to this point, it tends to things start falling over, and it's pretty obvious? Have you found that to be the case? But I've always wondered about like when people set these goals, like where does that number come from?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And the initial answer is it's partly picked out of the air initially. But the nice thing about SLOs is that they're an iterative process. So you got to start somewhere. And I think as you get to understand your system behavior, it's one of those things where you keep tweaking it over and over. And especially like after you have an incident and you breach an SLO, that's an opportunity for you to like, hey, is this SLO sufficient? Do we need to make changes to it? And for anyone who's interested in learning more about SLOs, SLOConf just wrapped up last month, and the recordings should be on YouTube. And also Alex Hidalgo, who's also a guest on Call Me Maybe, he has an awesome O'Reilly book on SLOs. So definitely recommend that folks check that out if that's something that they want to dig deeper into. And he digs deep.
Excellent. I will definitely include links to those as well in the show notes and watch some of those myself. So a couple of quick last questions for you. Outside of any sort of like technical literature, is there a particular book that you find yourself frequently recommending to people that you work with in the industry?
I don't know if it's if I recommend any non-technical books to folks, but definitely for me, like non-technical books that I've enjoyed personally have always been like biographies of folks, because it really shows like I think biographies are a great way to show like resiliency in humanity and different ways that people approach different problems. And like one of my favorite biographies has been the Steve Jobs biography by Walter Isaacson. It was one of those books where you're like, he dies, but you're like, till the very end of the book, you're like, please, Steve Jobs, don't die. And it's one of those, I thought it was a really well-written book because it's like, wow, what insight into the mind of somebody who was like such a polarizing figure. It was really cool. And yeah, those types of biographies, like I always enjoy biographies or autobiographies, just getting insights into the brains of other folks. I think it's just fascinating.
I know I haven't read a lot of biographies, but I've been finding myself enjoying them more than I feel like I used to. And I don't know, maybe it's a transitional period in my own personal life or what have you, but just it's been interesting how much I'm like, wow, I just like plow through a biography. Where a couple of decades ago, I'd be like, no, I need to focus on like upping my skill set as a software developer or someone running a company, and it's like kind of like business self-help type books in some ways. But I'm like, but it's like biographies, I'm like, I've also kind of always been like weirdly, it's an interesting thing about, you mentioned resiliency. There's not a lot of necessarily a lot of biographies about people that just didn't figure their shit out in life, And so
yeah,
it's kind of like survivor biasness in some ways, that like,
yeah,
there's something worth writing about them for some reason. So I've always been like, well, what if I might not be that kind of person. What if I'm just this person that's going to hit my head through life and anyway, I don't know where I'm going. I need a therapy session for this instead. So with that, so, you got your podcast going, you're, doing your developer advocacy work and participating in open source projects. Are there other things in the industry that you find yourself being really curious about and wanting to like dig into at some point, or things that you might be pretty skeptical about?
I guess the thing I'm a little bit obsessed with right now is this product called Cradix. It's an open source product, and its goal is to help like basically platform engineers. And I know one of the folks working there because I was chatting with her when I was doing research about like observability in QA. Abby Bangser, she works at Cradix, and she's done a lot of talks on observability and QA. And so that's how I got to know about Cradix, and I've just been playing around with their product to kind of see like what kind of cool use cases can I come up with. So I decided to do like a little POC where the idea is like platform engineers are constantly getting requests to, make things available for developers. And developers have to file a Jira ticket and wait for the platform engineer to do the thing. And as developers, we like our control. I want to do the thing myself. Just give it to me. Give me access. And so this allows this tool, and there are other tools like that do similar things. Like, for example, Crossplane and Port, I think, also do the same thing. But the idea is it's self-service tooling. So basically, a platform engineer says, okay, I have this capability that I can make available to you. And now, developer, if you want it, you can request it on demand. So the little POC that I had done with Cradix was, well, I love OpenTelemetry. So what if we use Cradix to deploy the OpenTelemetry operator to a Kubernetes cluster so that it could come pre-configured already to send traces to a tracing system such as Jaeger. And so it deploys the OpenTelemetry collector, configures it to send traces to Jaeger, deploys Jaeger, and deploys a test app so that you can make sure that the thing is working. So that was like my little POC, and I've been like playing with Cradix in other capacities. Like I'm trying to get it to deploy a V cluster on a Kubernetes cluster just for fun. I don't know, it feels like a cool use case. But yeah, the Cradix and OpenTelemetry operator POC, I have that on my GitHub, and I also wrote a blog post for them, and I presented on this type of thing at Cube Huddle in Toronto just last month. So yeah, I'm hoping I can play around with more of that, and then also play around a lot with trace-based testing. I started playing around with trace tests last year when they had just started, and so I've played around with trace tests here and there throughout, just kind of to see where the project's at, and it's been really cool to see where it's how much it's evolved over the last year. So that's probably something I'll be messing around with again in the near future.
That's awesome. Yeah, thanks for sharing a little bit about things you're kind of excited to play with and interact with. And I'll track down your GitHub profile and stuff like that so we can share some links to those projects. And I'll also include a link back to Abby's previous appearance on Maintainable. I think she was back in, like, she was I think she was episode probably in the 30s, so a number of years ago. So I'll include links to that for everybody in the show notes as well, so they can go back and listen to that if they hadn't had a chance to do that.
She's such a great guest.
Yes. So where can listeners best follow your thoughts and ruminations about software engineering and things like OpenTelemetry and your experiments and things like that in your blogging, primarily on your blog?
I'm all over the place, so you can find me on Twitter, you can find me on Mastodon, LinkedIn, I've got Instagram, YouTube, my blog on Medium, and I think that's mostly it. Oh, I am on Blue Sky. I haven't figured out Blue Sky, but you can find me on Blue Sky.
I'm still trying to track down an invite.
Oh, I can send you an invite code.
Oh, there you go. That would be awesome. I would like to poke around there, but yeah, I always find myself being like, all right, well, maybe I don't need to spend so much time on social media. Well, with that, it's been such a delight having you join us on Maintainable.
Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much for talking shop with us, Adriana.
Thanks for having me.
Maintainable.